And let's learn how to make dialogues. Now, the first thing you need to understand is that in your game, you can have as many dialogues as you want. You're going to create dialogues here in Candy Dialog Creator, and then you will export them to your game. And in your game, Candy Dialog Engine will load these dialogues and run them. So your game could have a single big dialogue, or it could have multiple smaller dialogues. There is also no limit to the size of a dialogue. It can be as long as you want. The next thing you need to understand is that dialogues are split into conversations. If you look up here, you have this button here, which says Conversation 1. And if you click on it, it's going to display a list of conversations. Right now, there's only one inside the default dialog. These two options here, user presets and profile presets, are not actual conversations inside your dialog, and I will explain later what they are. All you need to know right now is that if you have conversations in your dialog, they will be listed here below this line. And furthermore, conversations are split into blocks. And here we have a button to select a block. And by default, there's only one block inside this conversation. Now, you're probably wondering, how are you supposed to split your dialogue between blocks and conversations? What are blocks and conversations supposed to represent? And the answer is, there's no rules about this. You can freely decide how to split your dialogue. For example, your dialogue could be one single conversation and one single block if you want to. But if your dialogue is long, it's probably easier to split it. So this way, editing it is also easier. As an example, each chapter in your game could be a different conversation, or each quest in your game could also be a different conversation. It's really your own decision how you want to organize your dialogue. And one thing I want to clarify is that you can make your dialogue transition from one conversation and block to another conversation and block at any time. For example, in Conversation 1, Block 1, you could add a command that tells the dialogue, skip to Conversation 5, Block 7. That works. We will talk about transitions later. The important thing is that conversations and blocks are not isolated from each other. They can be connected to one another in many ways. You pretty much have complete freedom about this. And now, the last thing to understand about conversations and blocks is that blocks contain dialogue lines. A dialogue is a bunch of lines, and these lines tell the dialogue engine what it's supposed to do. Now, the most common line is the spoken line, which tells the dialogue engine that a character is speaking. And a spoken line specifies which character is speaking and what the character says, and possibly some other information. And to give you some other examples, there's also lines that can play media, there's lines that can call functions or modify variables, and many, many more. There's over 70 different types of lines currently. Now, to finish up here with conversations and blocks, let me show you how to add blocks and conversations. First, to add a block, just click the plus button here and give your block a unique name. Each block inside the same conversation must have a different name. So I'm naming this one block 2 and this one block 3. And now conversation 1 has block 1, 2, and 3. And now I'm going to add a conversation in the same way. I'm going to click the plus button and give it a unique name, conversation 2. And notice conversation 2 comes with block 1. This is not the same block 1 as conversation 1. Each conversation has its own blocks. Now, let me add some more blocks to conversation 2. And if you want to see the structure of your dialogue, that is, you want to see a list of all conversations and blocks, you can click this button here, Lines. If you click it, it becomes gray. And now, if you look here on the left, you will notice this list. It shows all the conversations and all the blocks in your dialogue. So we have conversation 1, and then block 1, 2, 3, and then conversation 2, and it has its own block 1, 2, 3. Now, you can reorder blocks simply by clicking and dragging like this. Notice that I moved block 1 at the bottom of the list. And if we click here, notice that the order matches. Now, reordering blocks has no effect inside your game. This is purely a convenience feature inside Candy Dialog Creator. You might find it convenient to have some blocks at the top of the list and some at the bottom. So that's entirely up to you. And you can also move blocks to a different conversation if you want. For example, here I can move block 1 from conversation 2 to conversation 1. And notice that conversation 1 also has a block 1. And a conversation can't have two blocks with the same name. So what happens? Well, it's very simple. Candy Dialog Creator automatically adds a suffix at the end of the name of the block that we moved. So since there's already a block 1, it renamed the block that I moved to add this number in parentheses at the end. And obviously I don't want this block 1 to be named like this. That's a bit weird. So now I can just rename it. If you right click on a block, you get this menu, click rename. I'm going to delete this and I will name it block 4. And now I'm going to reorder it at the bottom to keep them in numerical order. There we go. Very simple. And you can also reorder conversations if you want. It's the same way, just click and drag conversations. And once again, this has no effect in your game. It's purely a convenience feature inside Candy Dialog Creator. Notice, once again, the order matches. Conversation 2 first, and then conversation 1. Alright. Now, let's learn about lines. Let's click the lines button again. And now we can see here the list of lines inside the selected block. So right now we are working inside conversation 1, block 1. And this here is all the lines inside block 1. There's only one line. It's a comment line. Now, what's a comment line? Well, let me click on it to show you. First, there are 3 universal fields. There's meta reference at the top, and here at the bottom you have custom data and def comments. All lines have those 3 universal fields, and I'm not going to talk about them right now. I'm going to focus on what the comment line does. And the comment line has only one data field, and it's this one, comment. So what's a comment line? Well, it basically acts like code comments. A comment line does nothing in your game or in the dialogue engine. The entire purpose of a comment line is to be displayed here in the list of lines. When you have dozens of lines, it can be helpful to insert a few comment lines that remind you what each section of the block does. For example, here I can write dialogue start. And this reminds me that this is where the dialogue is expected to start in the game. And another option you have is to click this box, this square here. That's actually a button. Click on it, and now you can pick a color for the comment. You can pick any color you want, pick something that stands out, and there you go. And now let me show you spoken lines, because spoken lines are the type of lines you will be using the most in your dialogues. To add a spoken line, click here in the bottom left corner on the spoken line button. Spoken lines display a character's speech. Now, the first thing you want to do is indicate who is speaking. Now, you could type a name like this, but you can also save yourself some time and just click this button here with the 3 dots, and now you will see a list of all the characters in your actor's dictionary. Remember, in the settings, in the project data tab, we imported all the actors inside the actor's dictionary, and now Candy Dialogue Creator is able to create a list of all these actors, and we can just select an actor quickly this way. There we go. Next, you should select a portrait, at least if your dialogues are supposed to be displaying character portraits. So once again, you can type the name of a portrait file, but you can also click this button, and it's going to provide a list of all the portraits for the character. And not only does it list all the portraits, it shows you a preview. So this way you can make sure that you're selecting the correct file. Now, how does Candy Dialogue Creator get that list and those previews? Well, once again, let's go back to Settings, and let's go to the Project Paths tab. Remember, we told Candy Dialogue Creator where to find our project? Well, that's what it's doing. It's looking for our project, and then it's looking in the media folder for the character's portraits. Pretty cool, right? And on top of that, it's displaying the portrait right here, so you have it in front of you when you write, and that can be helpful. It provides some context. It can help you get the right tone for the line. Also, if you don't like the black background, you can just click on this and you get a color picker, and you can select a nicer color. Now, the color that you select here will not display inside Candy Dialogue Engine. This is just basically a personal preference to be a bit easier on the eyes, because the full black background is a bit harsh. So yeah, there you go. Next, we have the Play Portrait Animation field. This one is only relevant if you use animated portraits. Candy Dialogue Engine supports animated portraits in various ways, including videos, sprites, and several things. So if you're using animated portraits, you can select if the animation should play when the line is displayed, or if the animation shouldn't play. And if the animation doesn't play, the portrait will freeze on the first frame. So it will still show a portrait, it simply won't animate. Now if you want to animate, select True, and it's going to write 1. That's normal. By default, 1 is always selected because we assume that if you use animated portraits, most of the time you want to play the animation. So it saves you some work not having to select it manually each time. Also, in this case, this portrait here is static. It's not animated. But I can still leave 1. I don't have to change it to false. If the portrait is static, if it doesn't have an animation, and I select 1, nothing bad will happen. It's not going to crash. It's not going to cause an error. Candy Dialog Engine understands this is a static portrait. It doesn't matter what the value here is. And then we have dispositions. Now, I'm not going to talk about this very much right now. I will go into details later. What you need to know right now is that dispositions is a very easy way of telling the dialog engine if a line should be displayed or if it should be skipped, depending on a character's disposition. And disposition can mean anything. It can be a character's opinion of the player, it could be a relationship, it could be the character's mood. That's up to you. And now, here, where it's a speech, this is where you write what the character is actually saying. So, since this is the very first dialogue, let's write some type of introduction. Hello, I'm Alice. It's very nice to meet you. What's your name? There we go. And now, if you look here at the list of lines, notice that the line has updated. First, here it shows Alice. It tells us that Alice is speaking this line. And then it shows us what she says. Now, if you need some more space here to read everything, you can drag this to expand it. So just expand it to a comfortable size, and there you go. You don't really need to read everything, it's just supposed to remind you what line this is. Alright, anyway, notice that up here the line has been duplicated. Now that's pretty strange, isn't it? What's the purpose of that? Well, this is a preview of the line with BBCode formatting. So as an example, let's imagine that I add the BBCode bold tag like this. And notice up here, Alice's name is bolded. So this way you can see exactly what the line is going to look like in your game when the dialogue runs. Also, it's possible that your dialog box doesn't have a black background, or maybe the default text has a different color. So in order to make the preview match perfectly, you have these two buttons here, BG and T. You can't really see the T very well, it's white on white. BG stands for background, so click on it, and now you can select a different color for the background of the preview. So I don't know what color it is in your game. Maybe it's some kind of soft yellow, like this. Okay, and then you can also modify the color of the text if necessary. So here I can make it black. There you go. And this way you can see a preview exactly as it will appear in your game. Alright, let me just set this back. Oh, sorry, it was supposed to be white and black here. Great. Now, another convenience feature. If you look here, it says characters, words, and limit. Now, characters, it's the number of characters in the line. That includes letters, numbers, and punctuation. However, it doesn't include BBCode. Notice it says 63 characters, and watch what happens if I delete the BBCode tags. It still says 63. It knows BBCode tags should not be counted. And here it tells you the number of words, so there's 12 words in this sentence. Is that useful? Well, that's up to you. Some developers, some writers might find it helpful. The limit, it's a number that you can customize, and it tells you how many characters you have remaining until you reach the limit you have set. Now, what's the purpose of this? Well, in many games, the dialog box has limited space, so you need to make sure each dialog line isn't too long or it's going to be cut off on screen. You can set the limit here. If you go to Settings and the Preferences tab, right here where it says Speech Limit, you can set any number you want. And by default, it's 250. So this number here tells me minus 187. It tells me I have 187 characters remaining before I reach the limit. And the number is green because that's good. I can still add more characters. Now, once I get close to the limit, let me show you. There we go. See, the number is still under the limit, but it turned yellow. And that's because I'm getting very close to the limit, so it's warning me, be careful, you're close to the limit, consider shortening the text, split it over 2 lines, whatever. That's a warning. And you can customize the warning. It's right here, near limit, and by default it's 50. So when you have 50 characters or less remaining until the limit, it's going to turn yellow. And you can change it. You can make it 100 if you want. You can make it whatever you want. And if I exceed the limit, the number turns red, and it says, in this case it says plus 28, and that means I'm 28 characters above the limit. Now let me just delete this. I'm not going to talk about this here on the right. I will explain this later. And I'm also not going to talk about weight and text direction. I will also talk about it later. These 3 things are all related. Now let's talk about this here, voice file. As you can probably guess, the purpose is to indicate which voice file to play when this line is being displayed on screen. Assuming, of course, that your game includes voiced dialogue. Now, I don't have any voice files I could use to show you an example. During testing, I use music files, but they're copyrighted and I don't think I'm allowed to include them inside this video, even as a preview. So you're just gonna have to use your imagination. So here you would type the name of a voice file, or you could select one from a list. Now again, I don't have actual voice files, so when I try to show a list, it says no files available. That's normal. But if I had voice files, it would create a list just like it does for portraits. And in this list, if I hover over any file, it actually plays the file, so I can listen to it and I can make sure it's the correct file, which is very convenient. Now let's imagine that I have a voice file. What I could do, once I've assigned a voice file here, I can click play, and if this file actually existed, it would play the file. And here I would be able to modify the volume. And here, that would be the progression bar. So as the file plays, this would advance, and I could manually adjust it to skip back or forward if I want to listen to a specific part of the file. And this can be very convenient if you want to make sure that the text here, the way it's written, perfectly matches not just the words, but also the tone and the pace of the voice file. Now, let's go back up here you see these buttons. Well, if you're not using voice files, either you've already assigned all the voice files to spoken lines, that's done, or you will do the assignment later after you've written all the lines, or your game just doesn't use voiced dialogue, well, you can click the voice button and it's gonna hide the voice stuff. And this is gonna make the interface lighter, a bit more comfortable to use. You can also hide disposition if you're not using it, and you can even hide portraits in case your dialogues don't use portraits. Maybe you're making a visual novel, so you can really lighten the interface. Now, overrides is hidden by default, and translation is also hidden by default, and I'm not going to show these to you right now. I will talk to you about them later when they become relevant. And now let's look here on the right. You have this panel here which says Inserts at the top, and you have three tabs: Tools, User, and Profile. User and Profile are empty. This is normal. If you look at Tools, well, first here you have a bunch of buttons, and if you pay attention, you will notice these buttons actually match BBCode tags. So what do they do? Well, look carefully. If I click the B for bold, it's going to insert the BBCode tags to bold text. But there's more. Let's say I've already written my line and now I want to format it. So, for example, I can highlight Alice here, and then I can click the B button, and look at this. It inserted the bold tags around Alice. And you also have an option for color. Let me just remove the tags. So if you look here, you have some options to insert colors in your text. You may not see the button here because it's dark, but if I click here, I can select a color, and now the button appears. So I'm going to select a nice bright green. There we go. And now here, the color appears in two formats: hexadecimal and RGB. And what I can do here, I can click the C button, and that copies the color. And I can then paste it somewhere, like here. Or, what I can also do is this. I'm going to highlight Alice, and I'm going to switch here. You see the code button. I'm going to click on it, and notice that it changed the format here. Now it's showing this color inside BBCode tags. Let me just highlight Alice again, and now I'm going to click this arrow button to insert the tags around Alice. There we go. See this? It inserted the tags around Alice, and in the preview you can see that Alice's name is green. And if you click the BBCode button again, you have a third format, and this format is the GDScript format. That's GodoScript. So in GodoScript, this is how you write colors. Color, open parenthesis, then write the color value inside and close the parenthesis. Alright, let me just remove the tags again. And finally here you have more buttons, and these are specific to Candy Dialogue Engine. I'm going to talk about them more in a moment. Now let's look at the user and profile tabs. What are they for? Well, you can create your own custom insert buttons. Just click the plus button here, and this window shows up. And it's asking you here, where it says name, you need to enter the name of the insert, and that's the text that will appear on the button. So let me do this. I'm gonna name it Alice. And here it's asking me if I want to create a profile insert or a user insert. Now, what's the difference? A profile insert is exclusive to the current profile. So if you have different profiles in Candy Dialog Creator for different projects, if you select profile insert, you will only see this insert in this profile that you're working in right now. If you select user inserts, all the profiles, all your profiles will have this insert. So let's create a profile insert for now, because Alice is a character specific to this project. We don't need this insert in other profiles. And here we have to indicate a category, and we can create any category we want. So I'm going to create a category named actors. And then it asks for some text before and after. Remember how I showed you how the bold tag can be inserted around the word Alice previously? So normally you'd do this. Now, that's not what I want to insert. I just want to insert Alice. So this way I don't have to type it all the time. So I'm just going to write Alice for before, and I'm going to leave after empty. Create, there we go. And now what happens, you can see here, the category actors was created. And now there's a button with the text Alice. So what happens when I click the button? It inserts Alice. That's exactly what I wanted. Now let's create a user profile. So I'm going to click plus again, and this time I'm going to give it this name, bold plus italics. And I'm going to be using this in most of my projects. So I will make this a user insert. And I will create a category named BBCode. And this is what I'm going to write for before. And for after, this is what I write. So these are the opening BBCode tags, and these are the closing BBCode tags. Click Create, and now let's go to the User tab. The BBCode category was created, and we have our button, bold and italics. So let me highlight Alice's name once more, and if I click our new custom insert, it inserts the BBCode tags. And notice up here, Alice's name is bolded and also italicized. So there you go. That's the inserts, and it can save you a lot of time when you write dialogues. So now we went over the basics of adding a spoken line. So let's just add one more line. Click the spoken line button, and here I'm going to assign John as the speaker. And John has only one portrait in our files. And let's give him something to say to Alice. There we go. Hi Alice, it's nice to meet you too. I'm John. And now let's learn about testing our dialogue. So that's actually very easy to do. Now make sure in settings project paths, make sure you provided the path to your Godot project. And if you did that, you just need to do this. Click the test button here in the top right corner, like this. and a message is going to show up confirming that the dialog was exported. You can click the message to make it disappear immediately. Now here in our Godot project, you have the CandyD folder, and then you have the scenes folder. And here in the scenes folder, you have the testing scene. So let's open it and let's have a look. The testing scene is very basic. Its entire goal is to simply load the test dialog we just exported and run it. If you go back here to the CandyD folder and you go to the dialogs folder this time, you will see that we have this dialog here, testdialog.txt. And that's what happens when we click the test button in Candy Dialog Creator. It exports the opened dialog to this file, testdialog.txt. Keep in mind that every time you click the test button, it's going to overwrite this file, which is normal because this is just for testing. It's not a final export. Now, if you click on the testing scene node and you look here to the right at the inspector, you will notice there are 4 exported variables that you can configure. The first variable is dialog, and that's the name of the dialog file you want to test. So by default, that's test dialog. And if you had other dialogs here in the dialog folder, you could provide a different dialog name. For example, dialog1, if you had such a file. Next, you have the conversation variable, and this is the first conversation where we want dialog to start. So in our dialog, we want to start in conversation 1. Then you have the block variable, and that's the block we want to start at. And once again, we want to start at block 1. If you named your conversations and blocks differently, you need to change these values. And finally here, you have the line variable. And this is the first line we want to start at. 0 is the very first line in a block. Lines always start at 0 because they are stored inside an array. So 0 is the default, and we are fine starting at line 0, so we're going to keep 0 here. And now let's actually run the test. To do this, make sure the testing scene is currently selected, and then click here on the Run Current Scene button. Make sure you don't click the Run Project button. We only want to run the testing scene. So let's click here and let's see what happens. And here we go. Our dialog is immediately starting with Alice speaking. Notice that it's displaying Alice's full name. Remember, in the actor's dictionary, there's the display name key for each actor, and this is the value, the display name for Alice, Alice Turner. And here it shows what Alice is saying. That's what we wrote earlier in the Candy Dialog Creator, and we can see her portrait. And now let's press the Dialog Advance input, and it continues to the next line. John is speaking, and he replies to Alice exactly as we wrote it. And if I press the Dialog Advance button again, the dialog UI disappears because there are no more lines, so dialog automatically ends. Now, before we continue, we need to learn a little bit about the dialog UI. Go back here to the CandyDE folder and then to the Scenes folder, and here you have the Candy UI TSCN. Open it, and this is the default dialog UI. Now, if you look here, the UI scene has a root node, which is a canvas layer. And if you're a beginner in Godot, A canvas layer means that the UI will be displayed right in front of the camera. Even in a 3D game, it's always going to be displayed in front of the camera. Next, you can look here and see that the UI has a bunch of smaller scenes embedded. For example, you have a scene here called the dialog box, and if I make it visible, you can see that this is the dialog box from earlier. There's also a scene named portrait, and if I make it visible, that's the portrait box. There's also a scene called subtitles, and this scene displays dialogue in the same form as movie subtitles. And there's a bunch of other stuff. There's a scene here named history, and that's for displaying dialogue history. You also have a voice player, and that's for playing voice files for lines when you have voice dialogues. And then you have this node, media players, and it has multiple media nodes as children. There's an image player, which is actually a texture image node, a texture rectangle node, and that's for displaying images on screen during dialogues. Splash player, it's the same thing, but it takes up the full screen. It's for displaying splash screens instead. You have a video player, you have an animation player for playing visual effects, animations, and then you have some audio stream player nodes for playing all kinds of different sounds or music or audio during dialogues. For example, sound player could be used for playing sound effects, ambient player could be used for playing ambient sounds like birds chirping or wind, music player would be used for playing music, and speech player would be used for playing speech, except voiced lines. Now, the important thing to understand is that, first of all, you can customize all these nodes. If you don't like the way the dialog box looks, and I really hope you don't like it, because if you like it, I'm sorry to say you have poor taste. It's a very basic UI, it's not very pretty, it's not designed to look good. It's basically just a placeholder or a template. So I hope you intend to customize the UI. So yeah, if you want to customize the dialog box, you can absolutely do it, and I will explain how to do that later. But yes, you can do it, and I hope you do it. The same with the subtitles. You can customize the way that this looks. The same with everything, really, including the media players. When it comes to the media players here, you can remove media players that you're not using, or you can add more. For example, why do we have these 4 players for audio? Well, if you're a beginner in Godot, you may not know this, but audio players can only play one audio file at a time. So if you want to play a sound effect, and you also want to play ambient sounds and music at the same time, you need 3 different audio players, with each of them playing its own audio file. So if you need more audio players because you want to play many more sounds, you can. Candy Dialog Engine supports it. If you want more image players because you want to have images displaying in other parts of the screen, or you want to change the size of images, you can. We'll explain all this in more detail in a moment. For now, what you need to understand is that the Dialog UI is modular. You can modify the look of everything, and you can add more elements, or even remove elements that you're not using. Now, another thing you should understand is that you can have multiple dialog UIs. Candy UI is just the default UI. And by the way, Candy UI is an autoload. If you go to Project and then Project Settings, and then you go to Globals, you see Candy UI here. I showed you that before when we set up Candy Dialog Engine. Well, this is what Candy UI is. It's this UI scene. And since it's an autoload, your game can call it at any time to make it run dialogues. And that's what the testing scene is doing. Let's go back to the testing scene and let's look at the script for the testing scene. Here, this is the testing scene script. It's very basic, very short. And here's what it does. It calls two functions on Candy UI. It calls load scripted dialog, and that tells the Candy UI scene to load the test dialog. And then it calls Candy UI start dialog, and that tells the Candy UI scene to run the dialog that it just loaded. And that's how you will be calling dialogues when you want a dialog to run. You're going to call this function to load the dialog you want to run, and then you will call this function to actually run the dialog. Let's go back to the Candy UI scene. And another thing you need to know is this. The Candy UI scene has this script attached to its root node, candyengine.gd. And candyengine.gd, it's the full dialog engine code. This is the script that runs dialogues, and it does 90% of the work. The remaining 10% is inside the UI scenes. You can see those UI scenes have their own scripts attached. And now this is important because this means you can make your own UI scenes. You can have multiple dialog UI scenes in your game, and each UI scene acts as a standalone dialog engine. That means each scene can load and run its own dialog. And each scene, each UI scene can have its own settings, it can have its own input keys, and you can even have multiple dialog UI scenes running dialogues at the same time. Now, this is getting a little bit advanced, so I'm not going to go much further into this. But that's the important thing to remember. If you're making a simple game, you can use the Candy UI scene. It's probably enough. If you're making a more advanced game, you're not limited to just one UI, and you can run multiple dialogues at the same time. And you will see later that there might be cases where you want multiple dialogues to run. Now, let's look at how we can configure the settings for the dialog engine. If you click the UI scenes root node, Candy UI, the canvas layer, and you then go here to the inspector, you can see that there's a lot of exported variables. If you're a beginner in Godot and you don't know what an exported variable is, it's basically a variable inside a script. In this case, the variables here are found in the Candy Engine script. However, the Candy Engine script is shared between all the dialog UIs in your game. As I mentioned, you can have multiple dialog UIs, and they all share the same Candy Engine script. So if you modify variables inside the Candy Engine script directly, it's going to modify these variables for every dialogue UI in your game, and that's probably not what you want. So instead, you can export the variables, and when you export a variable, it shows up here in the inspector. And if you then modify a variable inside the inspector, it only modifies that variable for the selected node. So here we have dialog mode, and it's set to box. And that means we are telling the engine to use the dialog box to display dialogue. Now, if I want to display dialogues as movie subtitles, I could select subtitle mode. And this scene, Candy UI, would now display dialogues with the subtitle setting. But if I had other dialogue UI scenes in my game, they would not switch to subtitles. They would keep their own settings. Now let me just quickly show you what happens after I change here from box to subtitles. Let's go back to the testing scene again, and let's test our dialogue. And here you go. Notice that it's no longer displaying dialogue inside the dialog box. It's displaying dialogue as a subtitle format. The speaker's name is displayed at the start in parentheses. You can customize this. You could simply not display the speaker's name at all, or you could remove the parentheses, you could use brackets, you could simply add a colon after the speaker's name. You can even customize the colors of the text. We'll show you how to do this later. And now if I press the dialog advanced key, John answers. So as you can see, it's incredibly easy to change dialogue mode. You don't have to rewrite your dialogues at all. You can use the same dialogues in different modes. You can display the same dialogue in a dialog box, as a subtitle. There's also an option for a chat box format. And of course, you have an option for speech bubbles. Now, speech bubbles, we're going to talk about them a little bit later because they require some additional configuration. Let's switch back to box mode because now I want to show you the different portrait modes. By default, portrait mode is configured to all, and that means all characters will have a portrait displayed. But you have different options. If you select off, no character has a portrait display. Let me show you. There we go. We have the dialog box again, and this time no portrait. Now, another option is to display portraits only for the player or player characters, or display portraits only for NPCs. And now this one is interesting because you're probably wondering, how does the dialogue engine know which character is a player character or an NPC? And I'm going to show you this right now. Let's go back to our CandyDE folder, to the scripts folder, user data, and open the Candy database script that I showed you earlier. This is the script that contains the actor's dictionary, as a reminder. And the script also has this array here, player refs, and that's short for player references. And well, basically it's very simple. If an actor is a player character, you should add the actor reference to the player refs array. So here we have this reference for the player. It's called player, so we add it here. And we've also added player lowercase, just in case, by default. But player lowercase does not exist in the actor's dictionary. But, you know, if you want to change this to lowercase because you don't want to type uppercase letters when you write dialogues, player lowercase is already in there. So during your game, if the player can control multiple characters, anytime a character becomes a player character, just add it to the array. And when a player character is no longer a player character, remove it from the array. Very simple. So to go back here to the portrait mode, if you select player, it's only going to show a portrait if the character reference, the actor reference, is inside the player ref array. And if you select NPC, it will only display a portrait if the actor reference is not in this array. Then let me show you this quickly. You have some options for voiced dialogues. First of all, you can disable voice. It's enabled by default, and if you don't have any voice files, that's fine. You can keep it on, it's not going to hurt anything. But if you want to specifically disable it for some reason, just untick this, and it will never play any voice files, even if you have them. I'm not going to go over everything. There's some configurations for text-to-speech. By default, this is off. And then you have here box mode, and these are settings specific to box mode when dialogue is displayed inside the dialog box. Now, to show you what these settings do, if I click this here, enable box font color, it will allow the UI to dictate the color of the text for the dialog box. And for example, I could set this color. And here, enable box speaker color, it's the same thing for the speaker's name. So I can tell the engine to display the speaker's name in a specific color. Now let's go back to the testing scene, and you will notice that it's not working, which is totally normal. See, it's still white. And there's a reason for this. Let's go back to the Candy UI, and let's click the dialog box here. And notice the dialog box also has some exported variables. It also has text color and speaker color, and both options are enabled, and the color is set to white. So what's happening is the UI wants to give the text and the speaker these colors, but the dialog box is overruling this decision. The dialog box has more authority. So what I can do here is simply disable the dialog box's settings, and now if I go back to the testing scene, it should work. There you go. Alice Turner is written in green, and the speech is written in purple, and the same with John. So let's go back here, and I'm going to reset this, and I'm also going to reactivate this. And if I want to, I can also just configure the colors in the dialog box directly instead of inside the UI scene, like this. And if I go back to the testing scene, there we go. So yeah, there's that. What you need to remember basically is that the dialog box is more specific than the entire UI, so this is why the dialog box is overruling the UI itself. In Candy Dialog Engine, The most specific setting always overrules the less specific settings. Now, another option might be to provide settings, color settings for each actor. You can go back here to Candy Database, and if you look at Alice here, Alice has this key, box text color and box speaker color, and you can provide a color value. Like this. And here I'm going to provide this color. And no, actually I'm going to provide this color. Like this. Okay, so now I'm giving Alice custom colors for her speech and a custom color for her name. I'm going to save this, and let's go back to the testing scene and let's see what happens. Remember, the dialog box is configured to display the text and the speaker in white. Oh, sorry, wrong scene. Always remember to select your testing scene. And there we go. Alice's settings are overruling the dialog box, because an actor is more specific than the dialog box. The dialog box displays every actor's speech, and Alice is a specific actor. So this is the rule you need to keep in mind in Candy Dialog Engine. The more specific settings overrule the less specific settings. Now, if we go back to the Candy UI scene and we go back to the exported settings variables, notice that box mode has one more exported variable that I didn't mention so far. It's the box end of line string. And if you look at the value, you notice that it contains a BBCode tag, which is the pulse tag. It makes the text pulse. It's a visual effect for text. And these are the settings for the pulse effect. And then there's this arrow pointing down between the BBCode tags. So what is this? Well, let's go back to the testing scene. I've reset Alice's settings in the actor's dictionary. That's why the text is white again. And see this arrow here that is blinking? Well, that's exactly the end of line string. Where is it? Oh, here. See this? This is it. So what's the end of line string? Well, it's a string of characters that is automatically added at the end of every line, every spoken line. And you can customize it. It doesn't have to be this arrow, it could be something else. If there's a different symbol that you like, you can do it. Or you can just leave it empty if you don't want to display any symbol. And you don't need to use BBCode, that's optional. But if you want to have the blinking effect, that's a very nice way to do it. And why would you add a symbol like this at the end of a line? Well, it's supposed to subtly tell the player the line has finished writing, you can continue. You can press the dialog advance key. So that's up to you. You can modify it any way you like. You can use different BBCode tags. You can delete it entirely. And now if we look at the subtitles mode settings, notice here subtitles also have an end of line string and it's empty. So in subtitles mode, by default, there's no blinking arrow, there's nothing. But you can add it. If you want to add this in subtitles mode, just copy paste it, modify it, whatever you like. And since we're now looking at the subtitles mode settings, let's talk about them a little bit. Here you have the subtitle font color settings, so that's the same as the box settings, where you can specify a custom color for the subtitle text and speaker. I'm going to disable it. And here you have a few extra variables that the box mode settings don't have. You have subtitles show speaker, and this is telling the engine to write the speaker's name at the beginning of the text in subtitles mode. Let me show you again. I'm going to go back to the testing scene. See this? Remember that it's displaying the speaker's name, Alice Turner. So if I disable this and I test again, now it's not displaying the speaker's name anymore. And here, I mentioned earlier, you could configure if you want to display the speaker's name inside parentheses, brackets, if you just want a colon. Well, this is how you do it. I can replace the parentheses by brackets, or I could remove this one here at the top and just add a colon like this. And let me test again to show you. There you go. Now it shows Alice Turner, colon, hello, I'm Alice. So as you can see, it's very easy to configure. You want to disable the speaker name in subtitles, untick the box here. You want to replace parentheses with something else, just replace those two symbols here. Now I'm just going to reset them. Yeah, and then you get the chat mode settings, and yeah, the chat mode is more or less the same. Again, chat mode displays dialogue in a chat box format. Let me show you how it works. And there we go. We have, this is the default chat box. Again, the default UI is meant to be basic, so I expect you would modify it, customize it to look better. So notice here it shows Alice Turner, colon, and then it shows what Alice is saying. And if I press space, now John is speaking, so John's line is added. You can see that Alice's line is not removed. Alice's line remains on screen. It remains in the chat box, and John's line is added underneath it. So once again here, you know, for chat mode, you can specify a font color for the spoken text or for the speaker names. You can decide if you want to show the speaker names at all, and you know, if you want to add a colon, or if you want to write the speaker names between parentheses. By default it's a colon. You can add an end of line string, so that's the blinking arrow from earlier, or whatever you want to add at the end of the line when it's finished writing. And you have those three options here that the other dialogue modes didn't have. Let me explain what they do. So here, let's start at the bottom. We have chat hide on end, and that means when the dialogue ends, if this is enabled, the chat box will become hidden. So if you want the chat box to remain on screen after dialogue ended, you need to untick this, disable it. Here we have chat clear on end. And that means when the dialog ends, if this is enabled, the chat box content will be deleted. So if I do this, like this, I disabled hide, but I enable clear, the chat box will remain on screen when dialog ends, but its contents will be deleted. The chat box will become empty. And if I don't want to delete the contents of the chat box, I would just disable this. So now the chat box stays, and the text inside also stays. And here you have persistent chat, and it's basically asking, when a new dialog starts, should the chat box be reset, or should the text from the previous dialog remain? So if persistent chat is enabled, it's not going to reset the contents of the chat box when a new dialog starts. The new dialog will be added after the old dialog. If you disable this, when a new dialog starts, the old dialog is deleted from the chat box. So the chat box is starting fresh. It's starting empty. So you can just configure these settings however you like. That's up to you. Now, speech bubbles and barks. We're going to talk about these later because, as I mentioned previously, speech bubbles require a bit more setup than other dialogue modes. Let's talk about the writing settings instead. Now, the writing settings are related to the typewriter effect. The first setting here is writing speed, and this is the speed of the typewriter in characters per second. It's configured to 30, so that means Candy Dialog Engine will write 30 characters per second. Let me just show you what the default speed looks like again. There it is. That's 30 characters per second. Now, if you want to disable the typewriter effect entirely, you can just set it to 0, and let's see what happens. There you go. The speech is displayed instantly. No writing effect. Alright. Let's reset it back to 30. And here we have the continue fast speed. Now you may remember when we set up Candy Dialog Engine, I told you that in the project settings, in the input map, the installation added some input actions here. Dialog advance, dialog skip, dialog speed, and dialog slow. So when you press the dialog speed key, it's going to increase the speed of the typewriter, and this is the speed that it's going to be set to. So while you hold down the key for dialog speed, the typewriter effect will write at 60 characters per second, and of course you can modify it by any value you want. Let me show you what happens when I press the key. You can see here it writes faster. There's not much time to see it. Watch again with John's line. There you go. It's a bit faster. And next we have continue slow speed. And well, that's the opposite. When you hold the dialog slow key down, the typewriter effect is going to slow down, and here it's configured at 15 characters per second. Let me change it to 5 so you can really see it slow down. Now I'm holding the key and it's very slow, and if I release the key, it returns to the original speed. Let's see again with John's line. Hold down, release, there you go. So, you can set any values you want, and what I recommend is that in your game, in the options menu, perhaps, I assume your game will have an options menu, most games do, you could let the player provide the speed they like for all of these values. And next here we have the auto advance variable, and by default it's configured to -1. Auto advance is a feature where once a line has finished writing, the dialogue engine will automatically advance to the next line without the player pressing the dialogue advance key. And here you can write how many seconds the engine has to wait after the line is finished writing until it continues to the next line. So if you set it to 0, as soon as the line is finished writing, the engine will move on to the next line, and that doesn't leave a lot of time for the player to read the line. So what you could do is set 5 seconds here, and let me show you what happens. We're going to test again. Now the dialogue is writing, and now it's finished writing. It counts 5 seconds, and I'm not going to press anything. It automatically advances to John's line after 5 seconds. And after 5 seconds, it continues from John's line, and there's no more lines, so dialogue ends. Now keep in mind, it starts counting 5 seconds only when the entire line is finished writing. And here we have sync write speed voice. And yeah, that's a bit of a mouthful. What this is, when you have the typewriter effect, here it's configured to 30 characters per second. Let's imagine your line has a voice file attached, and the voice file is 15 seconds long. If you enable this, it's going to modify this, the writing speed. It's going to modify it so that the writing of the text is synchronized with the voice. So if the voice file is 15 seconds long, it's going to adjust the typewriter speed so the typewriter takes 15 seconds to write the entire line. And that ensures the text finishes writing exactly when the voice file finishes playing. And you might find that this feels more polished in your game. That's a personal preference. So all you need to do, if you want to synchronize writing speed and voice, just tick this box. That's it. And here we have await voice playback. And once again, this is related to voice the dialogue. If you don't have a voice file for a line, it does nothing. So what does this do? Well, let's imagine once again that your line has a voice file assigned. Basically, dialogue can't continue until the voice file is finished playing. So if the voice file is not finished and the player presses dialogue advance, nothing happens. You have to wait for the voice file to be finished, and then you can advance. And this also applies to the auto advance. If the text finishes writing first because you didn't enable synchronize, the auto advance won't advance until voice file is finished playing. It's going to start counting. As soon as the text finishes, it's going to start counting. So it's going to count 5 seconds. But after these 5 seconds, if the voice file is still playing, it will not auto-advance. And once the voice file ends, then it will auto-advance. Okay, I hope this is clear, and this is all for the typewriter effect and the auto-advance features. Now here we have some more settings that we are not going to talk about right now. We have settings for choice menus, for visual novel mode, for backgrounds. We're going to talk about these features in more detail later. Here we have the lexicon, and again we're going to talk about this later. The lexicon, it's a database of keywords that can be given custom BBCode formatting. So if you add a word to the lexicon, anytime that word appears in your dialogue, it will be automatically formatted, and you can configure how it's formatted. Also, the lexicon allows you to display a tooltip when a keyword is hovered with the mouse, and you can even make lexicon keywords clickable. Again, we'll talk about this in more details, but it's good for now to know what the lexicon is and that the feature is available. Next, we have settings for displaying and recording the dialogue history, and we will also talk about this when we discuss the history feature in more detail. Here we have settings for LLM speech. I don't remember if I mentioned this before, but Candy Dialogue Engine is compatible with an LLM, an AI. If you design your game to connect to an AI, Candy Dialogue Engine can then query the AI to generate dialogue for spoken lines. That's an optional feature, and it requires some setup. It's not that hard to do, but probably not for beginners. And we'll talk about this some other time. Next, you have mouse mode, and yeah, this one might be important to know about. If you're a beginner, in Godot there's 5 different mouse modes: visible, hidden, captured, confined, and confined hidden. Now, I'm not going to explain what these mouse modes do. These are Godot features, so read the Godot documentation. If you're making games in Godot, you should learn about this. What these variables do, well, it's very simple. When dialogue starts, you can set the mouse mode to a specific mode. So for example, you could hide the mouse when dialogue starts. And here, it's the opposite. When dialogue ends, you can set mouse mode to a specific mode. So here I could hide the mouse when dialogue starts, and then when dialogue ends, I can make the mouse visible again. Now there's also other options to modify mouse mode during dialogues. We'll talk about these later. But yeah, if you want to remove the mouse, hide it, or whatever during dialogues, this is where you can configure this. Now, variants, we're not going to talk about this right now. We will talk about it later. It's not very advanced, but it's a bit advanced for now. This is mostly an introductory tutorial. Now, suspend dialogue, I'm not going to talk about it in much detail. There's a lot of variables. What I'm going to say is just this for now. Candy Dialogue Engine has a built-in feature to suspend dialogue, and that means pause dialogue at any time. And it doesn't just pause the dialogue, it also pauses media files that the dialogue is playing. So it's a very powerful feature. The thing is, to pause the dialogue, you need to modify a variable. And you have different options. You can give the player an input, a key that the player can press to toggle the pause variable, or you can make your game code pause dialogue at specific moments. For example, when a specific game event happens and interrupts the dialogue. So you have to do a little bit of setup yourself, which is why I'm going to talk about this in more detail later. But it's not very complicated because all you have to do is modify a variable. That's it. And the only work you really have to do is to decide when do you modify that variable. So yeah, we'll talk about it later, but just so you know, the feature exists. And then we have the input settings. Now, inputs are, dialogue advance, dialogue speed, dialogue slow, right? These are the inputs. And you have two types of settings here. The first type is whether the UI, the dialogue UI, reacts to inputs. By default, this is enabled, so it's reacting. If you press dialogue advance or so on, it reacts. If you disable it, pressing dialogue advance, dialogue speed, and so on, it does nothing. And here, you can choose the name of the input actions. So you can see here, dialogue advance, dialogue speed, dialogue slow, dialogue skip. It's the same names that we have here. It's the same input actions. If you have multiple dialogue UIs, you can give them different inputs. So for example, I could create a new input called dialogue advance 2. And if I have a different UI, a second UI, I could assign it dialogue advance 2 to avoid conflicts with this UI. So this way, when I press dialogue advance, this UI reacts. And if I press dialogue advance 2, the other UI reacts to it. And finally, the last settings are the paths. And we're going to talk about this in detail later. The paths, well, you have different types of paths. First, you have UI element paths. And these are the paths to all these UI elements here. This is telling this dialogue UI where to find the backgrounds node, where to find the dialog box that it's supposed to use. So what this means is that, the dialog box here is a child of the UI, but it doesn't have to be. The dialog box can be elsewhere in your game, in your node tree. It can be in a different scene, and if that's the case, here you could tell the UI where to find the dialog box that it has to work with. Or you could add multiple dialog boxes. You could have 3 dialog boxes in the same UI, and then when the game runs, your code could change the dialog box that the UI is supposed to use. And then you also have paths for media players. So media players are the media players here, image, splash, video, and so on. So yeah, here you can also tell the UI where to find all the different media players, and you can add more media players if you need more, or you could remove media players that you're not using. All these media players are actually stored in a dictionary. So here, effect, image, splash, and so on. These are keys in a dictionary, so you can delete them, you can rename them, you can add more, and that means your UI can have as many or as little media players as you need. Again, we'll talk about all this in more detail later. Here we have the paths to where to find NPC and player nodes for bubbles, and we'll talk about that later as well. As I mentioned, bubbles require a little bit more setup. It's not very complicated. It's actually perfectly logical, but we'll discuss this later. And then you have the CS locations. CS is short for cutscenes, and these are used by the CS commands. Candy Dialog Engine has commands for cutscenes, and these cutscene commands they modify nodes in the game environment. They can move characters or objects, they can animate characters, they can rotate nodes, they can do all kinds of stuff, they can modify lights, change the active camera. And basically Candy Dialog Engine needs to know where all these nodes are located, so it needs paths for all these nodes. We'll talk about this later when we discuss the CS location, the CS commands. Okay, so that's all for the settings, and I know this sounds like a lot of information at once. As a reminder, you only need to learn the things you're actually going to use. So if some settings are not relevant to you, just forget about them. And remember, I mentioned that written documentation is provided with Candy Dialog Engine. It's inside the Documents folder when you download Candy Dialog Engine. So you can always read that documentation if you need some quick information about all this. Okay, let's now learn about customizing the dialog UI, because this is actually quite important in Candy Dialog Engine. The default UI is extremely basic. It's not original, it's not good looking, it has the bare minimum. It's basically there as a template. It's there so you can test, run dialogues out of the box. But we assume for your game you will want to give your UI some personality, make it look unique, and most of all, make it look nice. Okay, as an example, let's look at the dialog box scene. Now here, this is our dialog box scene, and you can see it's a bunch of control nodes. Now, I'm assuming you at least know how to make a UI with control nodes in Godot. If you're gonna make a game, this is something you need to learn. You don't have to code to create a UI, but you have to learn at least a little bit about control nodes. If you don't do that, you're probably never gonna manage to make a game. So you can see here the default dialog box has a panel container as a root node, and it has a script attached. And this script is provided by Candy Dialog Engine. Then there's a VBox container, another panel container, and so on. Now, here's how you make a custom UI in Candy Dialog Engine. All you have to do is create a UI scene with control nodes any way you want. You can use any nodes you want. You can stack them, parent them any way you want. It doesn't matter. There's only two requirements. First, the root node needs to have a special script attached provided with Candy Dialog Engine. That script contains code that Candy Dialog Engine is going to use. You can modify the code later, you can add more code to the script, that's fine, you can customize it, but you need to do that. You're going to have to attach a script to your UI root node. And the second thing that you absolutely have to do, you need to make sure your UI contains a few required nodes. There are a few nodes that Candy Dialog Engine requires in order to work with your UI. And these nodes are completely logical. For example, in the dialog box, there are two required nodes. And the first node is a rich text label, and it's used for displaying the speaker's name. It's this one here. The second required node is another rich text label, and it's used for displaying the dialogue. So that's obviously logical. You can't have a dialog box if you don't have nodes for displaying the speaker's name or the spoken text, right? And this is a basic principle for every UI element, whether it's the dialog box or, you know, background scenes that display background layers. Any Candy Dialog Engine UI element has a few nodes that must be present inside of it. Otherwise, it won't work as a dialog UI. Now, you're probably wondering, how do you know which script to attach? How do you know which nodes are required? Well, that's actually very simple. Go back here to the Candy Dialog Engine folder that you downloaded. Remember, this is where we have the first install folder, and we have the documents folder that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. If you go in the documents folder, and then you go to the guides folder, you will find the guides here that I mentioned, and some additional folders with more specific guides. And you need to look inside this folder here, UI customization. And inside the UI customization folder, you have PDF guides for every type of UI element. And let's look here at the PDF guide for the dialog box. And this guide is going to tell us which nodes a dialog box must have. It's right here, nodes, and here it talks a little bit about the root node. Does it have a required name? Does it have a required node type? And here, right there, required nodes. And it says the following nodes are required. Rich text label displays the speaker's name, and another rich text label displays the spoken text. So again, every UI element has a guide here, and those guides will tell you which nodes are required. And those guides will also discuss the script that you have to attach to your UI element. For example, here it says the script dialogbox.gd should be attached to the scene's root node. So all the information you need is right here inside those guides. Now, where can you find the scripts? Well, that's easy. You can go to the CandyDE folder and then to the scripts folder. And here you will find the scripts for UI elements inside two different folders. If it's a regular UI element like the dialog box, the script will be inside the UI elements folder. If the element is a media player, the script will be inside the media players folder. And as I mentioned, the dialog box script is found here inside the UI elements folder. Now, there's one thing I want to mention that's very important. When you create a custom UI element, let's say I'm creating a custom dialog box like this, you should not attach the default dialog box script or whatever script you find in here. And the reason for that is because when Candy Dialog Engine gets updated, these scripts can be modified, and this could result in your UI being modified when you don't want to modify it. So instead, you should do what I did here. Let me delete this. You should duplicate the scripts. Give them a custom name like this, and you can give them a number if you plan to have multiple scripts. And now I'm not going to attach dialogbox.gd to my custom dialog box. I'm going to attach the duplicated script like this. And now my UI will not risk changing if Candy Dialog Engine is updated. And now let's take a look at the script, because there's one more thing you need to know. So here it is. And as I mentioned earlier, each UI element normally has nodes that are required that Candy Dialog Engine is going to use. And I mentioned you can place these nodes anywhere you want in your scene, in your UI scene. But then how does Candy Dialog Engine know where to find these nodes? Because depending where you place the nodes, their path is going to change. How can Candy Dialog Engine know the path? Well, it's very simple. If you look at the script here, you have these variables here at the top: dialog node and speaker node. And this is what Candy Dialog Engine will look for. It's going to look at these variables to figure out where the required nodes are located in the scene. And here you have exported variables. You have dialog node path and speaker node path. And here in the ready function, when the scene is loaded or instantiated, dialog node path is going to be assigned to dialog node up here, and speaker node path is going to be assigned to speaker node up here. And because these variables are exported, you can modify them in the inspector. Let me show you. Let's go back to our custom dialog box. And if you select the root node with the script attached, right here in the inspector, you have dialog node path and speaker node path. So let me just add some rich text labels because I don't have them yet. And I'm going to name them speaker and speech. So now here I need to update the path. Speech and speaker. That's it. And it's not going to update them here. That's normal. Again, I mentioned this earlier. If you're a beginner in Godot, when you have an exported variable, that means you can modify it for each node. Each node that has the same script attached can have its own value. So you won't see the modified values in the script here, but it worked. It worked. This node here, it has this path for the dialog node path, and it has this path for the speaker node path. So that's all you need to do. Make sure you update the paths here to match your actual node hierarchy in the scene. And that's it. Candy Dialog Engine, whenever it runs a dialog line, it's going to look for the dialog box, and then it's going to look at this to figure out where is the rich text label for displaying the dialog speech, and where's the rich text label for displaying the speaker's name. So that's all you need to do. Let me just recap so everything is clear. You can make your custom scenes any way you like. You can use any nodes you want. You can use any node hierarchy you want. And you can modify the nodes any way you like. You can place them anywhere on screen. You can resize them. You can really do whatever you want. There's only two requirements. Attach a script to the root node. And again, remember to attach a copy, not the original script. This will avoid issues. And you need to include a few required nodes in your scene that Candy Dialog Engine will use. And then, in the root node, once it has the script attached, you need to provide the path to the required nodes. So, make the scene however you want, attach the script, add the required nodes, and update the paths to the required nodes. That's it. And again, all the information you need is here inside the Documents folder, and then the Guides folder, and then the UI Customization folder. That's it. And if you're having any trouble, you have any questions, you need help, you can go to our forum. It's on GitHub in the discussions. You can find the link on our website. So feel free to ask for help. We're always happy to help. Not a problem. But this should be simple. And, you know, I'm giving a lot of details here, a lot of explanations. I'm mainly worried about beginners in Godot who are not familiar with this stuff. I think anyone who has at least some intermediate skills in Godot should find this easy to do. It's fairly basic. Okay, let's now learn how to use speech bubbles. I mentioned earlier that speech bubbles require a little bit more setup than other dialog UI elements, and you're gonna see it's not very complicated. Here I created a 3D scene, and we're going to pretend that this is our game. So this would be the main scene of our game, and here we have a 3D world environment. That's the ground. And here we have this node named NPC. And we have two NPCs which are children of the NPC node. We have Alice and we have John. And here we have another node called player. And we have here a player which is not visible on screen at the moment, but it's there. Now, you can design your game node tree however you like, but one thing is very important if you want speech bubbles to work. All the NPCs must be placed under a common node. So Alice and John are NPCs, and that's why they are both children of this node here. You can name that node anything you want, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that the NPCs are children of it. And player characters must also be children of a same node. Now here, the player is a child of this node here. And again, this node could be renamed anything you want. But you can also place NPCs and player characters under the same node. That's fine. So, like this right here. Alice, John, and player are all under NPC now. So, it doesn't matter. What matters is all NPCs must share the same parent node, and all player characters must also share the same parent node, because this is how Candy Dialog Engine will find them. We're going to tell Candy Dialog Engine NPCs are located under this node, and player characters are located under that node here. So now, how do we tell Candy Dialog Engine where the path to the NPCs and the player characters is? Well, it's very simple. We go back to our dialog UI, and in this case, it's the Candy UI. And make sure you select the root node, and then here in the inspector, you have the paths category, expand it, and you have these two variables here, bubbles NPC path and bubbles player path. And here you just have to write the path to the NPC node from the root of the game, and also the path to the player node from the root of the game. So here I have root game NPC, and let's check that this is correct. Yes, root, which is not written here, game NPC. So now Candy Dialog Engine knows where to look for our NPCs and where to look for player characters. Very simple. Okay, but now there's one more thing we need to do, and that's assigning speech bubbles to characters. Now, assigning speech bubbles, it's also quite easy. First, you need to go here to the CandyDE folder and go to the scenes folder, because speech bubbles are scenes. And then you scroll here to the speech bubbles 2D or speech bubbles 3D folder, depending if you're making a 2D game or a 3D game. Candy Dialog Engine provides default speech bubbles for both 2D and 3D. Now, this is a 3D game, so obviously we're going to use the 3D speech bubbles. And here we're going to use default. Do not use Candy default. This is a template, and it can be modified when Candy Dialog Engine updates. You're supposed to copy the template and use the copied scene and customize the copied scenes if you want. So default is actually already a copy of the Candy default template. So we're going to use default.tscn inside the speech bubbles 3D folder. And all we need to do is simply assign it to each character. So I'm going to give Alice a speech bubble. There we go. I'm going to give one to John, and I'm going to give one to the player in case the player shows up later. But now there's still one more thing we need to do. We need to help the Candy Dialog Engine find where the bubbles are inside the character. So here's how you do this. You're going to attach a script to your character, and you need to create that script. It's not provided by default. So I'm just going to make this script quickly, character.gd, create, and it's attached to Alice. And what you need to do here, I'm going to delete this because I'm not making a full character. You need to include this code here in your character script, right there. OnReady variable internal node dict. That's basically a dictionary for nodes that Candy Dialog Engine might look for. And in this dictionary, you need this key, speech bubble with an underscore to separate the two words, and then get node speech bubble. And make sure you write the correct path to the speech bubble from the character node. So let me show you. I'm going to make this smaller so we can see everything at once. Here we have Alice right here, and we have the speech bubble directly under Alice. And since Alice is the node with the script attached, this path here is correct. If you rename the speech bubble to something else, make sure you update this. And, you know, if you place the speech bubble elsewhere inside Alice, for example, let's imagine that I do this, like this, Alice, then bubbles, and then speech bubble. Well, in that case, I would update the path like this. Okay. I'm gonna undo this. Right, and yeah, make sure you save the script. And now what's gonna happen is Candy Dialog Engine, when it needs to display a speech bubble for Alice, it's going to look for Alice under this node here, NPC. And when it finds Alice, it's going to look inside her script to find her speech bubble. So this is going to tell Candy Dialog Engine where Alice's speech bubble is. Alright, I'm going to close this now. And we're going to assign the script to the other characters. And they have the same path to the bubble, so we don't need to use different scripts or update anything in their scripts. It's going to work as is. Now, before I show you the speech bubbles actually working, let me just remind you, when you download Candy Dialog Engine, you get the Documents folder, and inside the Documents folder, there's the Guides folder, and you can go here to the Spoken Lines folder, and you will find this PDF document, speechbubbles.pdf. And if you open it, it's going to tell you everything you need to know about setting up and using bubbles. And it's even going to show you the script that I just copied to tell Candy Dialog Engine where to find the speech bubbles. If you want to copy paste the script, it's right here. You can copy this and then paste it inside your Godot script. And there's more pages with more information. So yeah, all the information is here. You don't have to come back to this video. Alright. So now, if we want speech bubbles to be used for dialogues, we need to go back to the Candy UI scene. And we can minimize the paths. And now we need to go here to dialog display. And in dialog mode, we need to select bubbles. And that's going to tell Candy Dialog Engine, display all the dialogue inside bubbles. That's it. So just to recap, first make sure that all your characters, all your NPCs are placed under the same node here. Something I didn't mention, make sure the names of the characters match the actor references. So if you write Alice with a capital A as the speaker for a line, her node here has to be named exactly the same with capital A. This is how Candy Dialog Engine will find it. And so make sure the NPCs are all under the same node. Make sure the player characters are all under the same node. NPCs and player characters can also be under the same node if you want. Then go here to your dialog UI, update the paths to the NPCs and the player characters, add bubbles to your characters, and your characters should have a script, and in that script, provide the path, the internal path to the bubbles. Okay. If you're going to use speech bubbles, you know, this might seem like a bit of work, but if you're going to use speech bubbles in your game, you do it 3 times and then it becomes very easy, very simple. Okay, so, and yeah, finally, as I just mentioned, remember to set the dialogue mode to bubbles, otherwise it's not going to display the speech inside bubbles. Alright, now I'm going to finally show you what speech bubbles look like. And this time, I'm not going to use the testing scene, because the testing scene doesn't have the 3D environment, so it wouldn't work here. There's no characters, there's no bubbles. So instead, my 3D scene here has some code. So when I run the 3D scene, it's going to play the test dialog just like the testing scene does. So yeah, this is one of the limitations of the testing scene. It cannot test anything that requires a game environment because the testing scene is empty. So when you want to test speech bubbles, for example, you need to run the dialogue in your game environment. Okay, let's go. Let's try it. Okay, the first thing you will notice is that the speech bubble here, it's working. The bubble is visible for Alice. Her speech is written inside, but the bubble is obviously too low. It should be higher. And the same for John, his bubble is stuck inside of him. That's normal. I'm going to show you a few more things you need to configure. Nothing difficult. Once again, if you're going to use speech bubbles, this is going to get very easy quick. Okay, select Alice's speech bubble. And here in the inspector, there's a bunch of exported variables. Now, what we want to do here is modify the Y offset so we can make the bubble, we can position the bubble higher. I don't remember exactly the perfect location, the perfect distance, so I'm going to try 1. And for John, I'm going to try 1.5, and we're going to see which one looks better. Yeah, Alice is now, her bubble is now higher, but it's a bit low, and John is just right, so we're going to use 1.5. Now, you know, the height of the bubbles is going to depend on how tall your character meshes are and where the origin of your character meshes are. The origin here is in the center. If the origin was somehow here above, the bubble would be higher because it would be relative to that origin. So, you know, you might have to do a bit of tinkering, but typically, in most games, you're not going to do this work for every character. Usually in a game, you design a basic character, and all the characters use that same base, and the base includes the bubble. And then you just customize the base, change the mesh for each character to give them a unique look. But since the bubble is part of the base, you don't have to modify the bubble settings for everyone, except maybe when a character is taller or shorter than the others. Alright, now you also have an X and Z offset variables. Personally, I'm not going to recommend modifying them because, you know, I'm happy having the bubbles centered above the character. But yeah, you know, if I did this, for example, that's Alice. Yeah, her bubble looks big because now it's closer to the camera. Remember, the bubble exists inside the 3D world, okay? So here the bubble is closer to the camera, so let's actually place it further in both directions. -2, and let's test it. There you go. Again, the bubble looks like it's flat in front of the camera, but it's actually a 3D object inside the 3D world, so that's why it's smaller, because it's further away. right? Now, you could do that if you want to, but personally I don't like it, so I'm gonna keep X and Z set to 0. And here you have max width. Now max width, that's how large the bubble can get. It's the maximum width of the bubble. So let me show you Alice's bubble again. Okay, this is how large it gets. And the text is split over 2 lines because the text is longer. There's not enough space to fit in one line. So let's see what happens if I double the max width. See this? Now it fits in one line. But, you know, in my opinion, it doesn't look very nice. It's too wide, too thin. So personally, I would keep it at this value. But again, it depends on your game. It depends on the size of the text, on the size of the font. It depends on a lot of things. So you can customize this however you like. And finally here you have text width margin. And this adds some padding on each side of the text so that it doesn't touch the edges of the bubble. Let me show you the bubble again. Notice there's a small space here between the text and the edge. Now let's see what happens if I set this to 0. Okay, the space is still there. That's probably because the bubble has some margin built in. Let me expand it. I'm gonna make it really big. There you go. Now you can see it's adding a lot of padding. I went from 16 to 512. So it's adding a lot of padding on each side. That's probably too much. It doesn't look good at all. So, you know, it depends on the bubble you're using, and it depends again on the font size of the text. So 16, it's fine here. But in your game, with your custom bubble textures, with your custom text font, 16 might be too small, too big, so you can adjust it. And finally here, like all the elements for displaying spoken text, you have options for configuring the color of speech bubbles, specifically the color of the text. So if you enable this and it's enabled by default, then here you can change the color of the text inside the bubble. It's set to black by default, and here I could set it to blue. And you can see here Alice's bubble now writes blue text, but I only changed it for Alice, so John's bubble is still writing in black. You can also assign Alice a custom color for speech bubbles inside the actor's dictionary if you want. So that's another option. And note that speech bubble do not support different colors for the speaker's name. You can, I think you can display the speaker's name inside speech bubbles, if I'm remembering correctly, like the subtitles mode does, but there's no option to give the speaker's name a different color than the text because speech bubbles are finicky. They're not easy to configure, and we had some trouble making it work with different text colors for the speaker and the text. And I'm going to show you in a minute how speech bubbles are made, what the scene looks like exactly, and you will understand why it's been a bit tricky to set them up properly. And lastly here, you have the default z variable. Now, this relates to the z index, the z order of the speech bubble. If you don't know what the z index of a node is, I'm not gonna explain it here. It's a Godot thing, so, if you don't know what it is, you probably don't need it. And if you do know what the z index of a node is, well, this is how you can customize the z index of a speech bubble. You can just write whatever value you want here, and then the bubble's script is going to assign this value as the z index for the bubble. Now, let me show you a few more features about speech bubbles. Here, I have a new dialogue, and we have 3 characters speaking. Alice says, "Hello, I'm Alice," and then Eric says, "I'm Eric," and finally Julie says, "And I'm Julie." Now, there's a little problem here, because Alice has a speech bubble, but Eric doesn't have a speech bubble, and Julie is not present in the scene at all. So, what's going to happen? Well, let's test it and see. Now, Alice is speaking using a speech bubble, which is normal. Eric is here, but he doesn't have a speech bubble assigned, so what's going to happen? Oh, he's speaking using the dialog box. But what about Julie? Because Julie is not even present in the scene. She doesn't even have a mesh node to represent her. Well, she's also speaking with a dialog box. And just a side note, you may notice that Julie and Eric don't have portraits, and well, that's because they don't exist in my game files, so I don't have any portrait files for them. So the missing portrait is normal, don't worry about it. Anyway, as you can see, when a character does not exist in the scene or doesn't have a speech bubble assigned, Candy Dialog Engine automatically switches to another dialog mode. Now let's close this, and again, small side note, you can ignore these errors. It's just Candy Dialog Engine telling us that it couldn't find a portrait file for Eric and Julie. Again, that's normal. So now let's look here. Let's go back to the Candy UI scene, and here in the inspector we have the speech bubbles variables. And here we have this variable, bubble exempt mode. And this variable, it's basically telling the Candy Dialog Engine which dialog mode to use if speech bubbles are not available. So here it's set to box. So since Eric doesn't have a speech bubble, and since Julie is not even in the scene, the Candy Dialog Engine will use the dialog box to display their speech. And you can change it to any other mode you want. Now, don't change it to bubbles, because that would break, obviously. There's no point in that. And don't change it to VN bubbles, and probably don't change it to barks, because that's something else entirely. But, for example, you could change it to subtitles if you want to. And now, let's test it. So Alice is using her speech bubble, and now Eric is using the subtitle display, and so is Julie. Now, let me show you one more feature. I'm going to go back to the Candy UI, and instead of using speech bubbles, I'm going to make the entire dialogue use the dialog box. Okay, so let me just quickly show you so everything is clear. There you go. Now it's using the dialog box again, and that's for everyone. Okay. Now, what if I want Alice to use speech bubbles while everybody else is using the dialog box? Well, I can do this. I can go back here to the actors dictionary, and in Alice's entry I have this here, bubbles override, and by default it's set to 0. Now, if I want Alice to use speech bubbles, no matter how the engine is configured, I can set this to 1. And let me show you here. Alice is going to use a speech bubble now. And any other character who speaks would use the dialog box because that's what the engine is configured to use. But I can also do the opposite. Imagine that I don't want Alice to use speech bubbles. So now I'm configuring the engine to use speech bubbles for everybody. But I never want Alice to use speech bubbles. Well, I can set bubbles override to -1. And now Alice is forbidden from using speech bubbles. Let me show you. And you can see here, Alice is using the subtitles because the engine is configured to use subtitles as an alternative to bubbles. So the engine is trying to use speech bubbles for everybody, but Alice is specifically forbidden from using bubbles. So we're using the alternate mode. So yeah, in the alternate mode, as a reminder, it's this here, under speech bubbles, bubble exempt mode. Okay, I hope that's clear. I hope this is clear because there's more. Now, right now, Alice is forbidden from ever using speech bubbles. But let's imagine that for this line here, it's nice to meet you, I want Alice to use a speech bubble anyway, but only for this line. Well, here's how you do it. Up here, you have this button, it's grayed out by default, it's called Overrides. And if I click on it, it's going to display these 4 override fields. Now, we're going to focus on this one, speech bubbles override. And what I'm going to do, if I click the button here, you can see I have 3 options. I have default, and that's 0. This is saying use the engine settings or use Alice's settings. Okay. Here I have forbid, and this means that Alice, if I select forbid, Alice is not allowed to use speech bubbles for this line, no matter what the other settings are. So now I'm going to use force, and it's going to set the value to 1. And this is saying, for this line specifically, Alice must use a speech bubble, and it doesn't matter what the other settings are. It doesn't matter what the engine's settings are. It doesn't matter what Alice's settings are. This line demands a speech bubble. So let's try it. The first line is displayed in subtitles mode because Alice, in general, is forbidden from using speech bubbles. That's normal. But now, the second line is written in a speech bubble because the second line is forcing Alice to use a speech bubble. See, it's nice to meet you. That's the same line here where we set speech bubbles override to 1. And now let's continue to the third line. And now Alice is using subtitles again because she's forbidden from using speech bubbles. And the third line is not forcing her to use a speech bubble. Now let's take a look at the speech bubble scene so you understand at least a little bit how it's designed. Here we have the scene for 3D speech bubbles, and notice it has a 3D node as a root and it has a sprite 3D. And the 2D speech bubbles have a 2D node as a root and they have a sprite 2D. So the two bubbles, 3D and 2D, are identical It's just that the 2D speech bubble is using 2D nodes and the 3D speech bubble is using 3D nodes. That's the only difference. And something you should know is that in Godot, there's different ways of designing speech bubbles. A lot of methods, a lot of tutorials will show you how to create speech bubbles by drawing the bubbles on a canvas layer in front of the camera. And this method requires calculating where the characters are located in relation to the camera angle so that the bubbles get drawn at the right place on the screen. It requires updating the speech bubbles anytime the camera moves or the character moves. It's not a bad method. I don't know about the performance because I never really tested it extensively, but you know, it's a method that many people use, so it probably works fine. And there might be all kinds of different methods that I'm not aware of. Now, Candy Dialog Engine uses a different method. The method we use is very simple. So as I mentioned, we use sprites, either a sprite 3D or a sprite 2D. And if you're a beginner, a sprite displays a 2D image. If you have a 3D game and you want to display a 2D image floating inside the 3D environment, you can use a sprite 3D to do that. That's what bubbles are. They are 2D images floating inside the 3D environment. So we use a sprite 3D or a sprite 2D. The problem is a sprite needs a texture. And in the case of speech bubbles, there's two things. There's the bubble itself, basically the background, and there's the text. Now, the background is an image. We could use that as a texture, but the text itself can't be used as a texture. We cannot display text in a sprite directly. Okay, a rich text label can't be a texture for a sprite. So, we use a clever trick. We add a sub-viewport to the speech bubble scene. And think of the sub-viewport as a camera that's filming the rich text label. That's a bit of a simplification, but it's the basic idea. So we have this sub-viewport, and it has the rich text label as a child, so it's basically filming the rich text label like a camera. And the sub-viewport is assigned to the sprite as a texture. So the sprite is showing what the sub-viewport is filming. Think of it that way. Again, I'm simplifying a bit, but that's the basic principle of those speech bubbles. And this is how we manage to display text inside a sprite 3D, by using the sub-viewport as an intermediate. Now I'm going to show you an easy customization option for speech bubbles. Even a beginner can do it. It's very, very easy. If I go back to my 3D scene and I run it just to show you the speech bubbles, you can see here our speech bubbles are not very nice. They have this flat white background. They have a black border. That's okay. They have square corners. Usually, you know, you might want speech bubbles with round corners to look a bit more like a comic book. You might want speech bubbles with a tail. You might want some texturing instead of just a flat color. So yeah, I'm sure you want to customize those speech bubbles, make them look a bit better and more unique to your game. And I really encourage you to do exactly that. Well, that's very easy to do in Candy Dialog Engine with our default speech bubbles. All you need to do is here, click the rich text label. And here, if you scroll down to Theme Overrides and then Styles, you have these two resources here, Normal and Focus. Just open them, and here they have a texture. And that texture, you can see it here, it's our speech bubble background with the black border and the white fill. So all you need to do, create your own speech bubble texture. You would do this outside of Godot, inside a 2D drawing software, or you might find a texture online, you might buy it, I don't know. And then you can just change the texture here with your own. You're going to have to configure the texture margins, and at this point this is basically Godot stuff, so I'm not really going to explain it further. You need to read the Godot documentation or follow some tutorials, but that's really how simple it is to modify the texture of the speech bubbles. Just replace the texture image with your own, with any image of your choice, and just adjust the margins to fit your custom texture. And then you can have whatever look you want for the speech bubbles. That's it. And now some final words on speech bubbles. I mentioned earlier that there's other methods of doing speech bubbles in Godot, including drawing speech bubbles on a canvas layer, and possibly some other methods that I'm not aware of or I'm not remembering right now. I believe Candy Dialog Engine is compatible with all these other methods. I didn't test it, but I just don't see why it wouldn't be compatible. And I'm going to show you why. Okay. Here, speech bubbles have a script attached. So if you open the script, I'm not going to explain everything. There's more information in the documentation, in the PDF guides. But here we have this function, show text. And that's the function Candy Dialog Engine calls when it wants to display text in a speech bubble. So when Alice speaks and she's using speech bubbles, Candy Dialog Engine calls that function in Alice's speech bubble, and the function takes care of displaying the text. And there's some other functions, but basically this is the only connection between speech bubbles and Candy Dialog Engine. So if you use another method, another type of speech bubble, you just need to make sure this function exists in your speech bubble. Your speech bubble will need code somewhere, and that function has to exist because Candy Dialog Engine is going to call it. And you need to make sure that the function is designed to display text inside the bubble. So it doesn't matter if the bubble is a sprite 3D or if it's drawn on a canvas layer. What matters is the function here exists when Candy Dialog Engine needs to call it, and the function makes the bubble display on screen and display the text that's supposed to be displayed. Now, if you use a different type of bubble, a different method, you will probably need to change some of this code here. So I'm not saying you can use that function as it is with any speech bubble. You will need to modify this, most likely. But it can be done. If you're seriously considering using a different type of speech bubble, a different method, then you probably have the skills to modify that function, that code, to fit whatever speech bubble you're going to use instead. Right? And you can see here the code itself is not complicated. It makes the bubble visible first, because we want bubbles hidden when a character is not speaking. So once a character speaks, actually no, it hides the bubble first and then it configures it. My bad, sorry. It hides the bubble, then it configures it, and you can see the code here is not very complicated. First, it hides the bubble as a precaution in case it wasn't hidden before. So this way the bubble doesn't look weird when it's being set up. It assigns the custom color for the text. It resets the size to the minimum so the bubble isn't too big. It does a bunch of things, and then it starts assigning the text inside the bubble, and so on. It's really not complicated code. And you can see here that the function is not very complicated. It should be quite straightforward. I'm not going to explain everything, but if you're really considering using your own type of speech bubbles and modifying this code to make it work, you will have no trouble understanding what this does. Right. So, yeah, my point is here, this is an introductory video. I'm not going to go into details how to use custom bubbles. The only thing I want you to remember is that if you don't like those bubbles for some reason, you'd rather use a different method, Candy Dialog Engine should be compatible. It shouldn't be an issue, but you may have to modify some code. And depending on the method you use for speech bubbles, you may have to create a new dialog mode. It's possible in some cases that the bubbles mode as it is may not be compatible with your chosen speech bubble method. So in that case, you would have to simply write code for an alternate method. Okay. But again, if you're seriously considering using a different type of speech bubble instead of the default ones, you probably have the skills to do all these code modifications. And it's not very hard. You need some, it's not easy for beginners, but it should be doable for someone with intermediate skills in Godot. And one very last thing that I want to mention, because this is somewhat important, when you use speech bubbles in your game, when you have speech bubbles in a scene, you will probably see some red warnings here in the output. And these warnings say something like the path to subviewport is invalid. Now, these warnings don't seem to be causing any problems. They don't seem to be causing bugs or crashes or any issues, so you can ignore them. And the problem is we can't fix whatever is causing these warnings because everything seems to be working fine. The bubbles work fine, there's no problem at all, and the warnings appear inconsistently. They seem to appear at random in the Godot editor. They don't appear every time we run a scene with bubbles. They don't appear every time we open Godot. They don't appear every time we add a bubble to a scene. It's really strange. We can't figure out what's causing this at all. Okay, so far we've seen a lot of basic features and even some intermediate features about Candy Dialog Engine and Candy Dialog Creator. There's still several more features I want to show you, but at this point you might be getting tired and you might want to start making your own dialogues for your Godot project. So what I'm going to do first, I will show you how to make a final export of your dialogues to your Godot project. And then I will show you how to load and run dialogues inside your Godot project. Okay, so up here in the top left corner, you have these two buttons with arrows. The first button with the arrow up is the export menu, and the second button with the arrow down is the import menu. Click the export menu with the arrow up, and here the export menu appears. Here in the central area, it shows all the conversations and blocks inside your dialogue. And you can basically select which conversations and blocks are going to be exported, and if there are any conversations or blocks you don't want to export, they won't be exported. For example, if I untick this block here, it will not be exported. Or if I untick conversation 3, it won't be exported. Now notice when I unticked conversation 3, blocks 1 and 2 did not automatically untick. But that's okay, since conversation 3 is not ticked, it's not selected, none of it will be exported. Now, I'm just going to tick everything for now. Here, make sure the mode is set to overwrite, and make sure here it's set to all. And I'm not going to talk about what these things do right now. The purpose of this video is to give you the basic information you need. The other export modes are more advanced. I would guess that 90% of users only need to use the overwrite mode. So if you want to learn about the other modes, you can read the documentation, or I might make another video on this later. Okay, so basically, when you want to export the dialog, you just open the menu, make sure it says overwrite, make sure it says all, tick or untick whatever you want to export. And now here at the top, click the button with the 3 dots, and we're going to select a file to export to. So when you click the button, it opens this dialog menu, this file dialog menu, and the menu here automatically opens to our dialogs folder inside our Godot project. You can see here we have the test dialog file that we created earlier when we did a bunch of tests. So make sure you are indeed inside your Godot project's dialog folder, and then here write a name for the exported dialog. For example, I'm going to name my exported dialog dialog1, and make sure you have the txt extension here. Click save, and now it's going to show the file and path right here in this field. And that's it. We told Candy Dialog Creator which dialog file we want to export our current dialog to. And all we need to do is click the export button here at the bottom. It's going to ask to confirm, and then we get this confirmation message here, and if you want to hide it, just click on it. There we go. Our dialog has been exported, and now let's just check that it's been exported. So we're going to reopen the export menu, and we're going to click the button here again, and we are back inside our project's dialogs folder, and we can see now that dialog 1 has been created. It wasn't there before. So yeah. Now let me just mention the import menu. And the import menu, it's the same thing in reverse. Basically, you select a dialog file you want to import, click open, and now here it shows you the conversations and the blocks inside the file. And you can then import this dialog, and if you select overwrite here, it's going to replace the dialog that you currently have loaded inside the Candy Dialog Creator. So make sure you save your work before you do this. So yeah, you can then click import, and it's going to ask you to confirm. And there you go. Now we're not going to see any difference because we just imported the dialog that we exported a few seconds ago. So we imported the same dialog we already had loaded. Anyway, so yeah, that's it. Export and import, it's that simple. And one thing I want to mention, export should be used for dialogues that are finished. Don't use export and import as your default save system. You can if you really want to, but it's just not what it's made for. If you're working on a dialogue and you want to take a break, you want to close Candy Dialog Creator, and you want to finish the dialog later, you can just save your work here. And you have two options. You can just click Save, or you can right-click Save, and you have a bunch of options. You have Save As, where you can specify the file you want to save to. You have Save Incremental. This is going to create, each time you select this, it creates a new save file with the date and time added to the file name. So this way you're not overwriting your earlier save. So yeah, it's up to you, and if you click Save, it's going to ask you where you want to save, so you can select a file. If you don't have a file, you can just write a file name. There you go. And then you have Load, and when you load, you have three folders here. There's a folder for autosaves, in case you want to load an autosave. There's a folder for quick saves, and you have a folder for manual saves. And what I did just now earlier was a manual save. If I go in the manual saves folder, you can see I have my two save files, and that's the one I just created a few seconds ago. So yeah, if you're just saving and loading unfinished dialogues, you should use this, and export import should be for dialogues that are finished. Okay, that's all about exporting. I'm not going to take up more time for this. And now I'm going to teach you how to load a dialogue in your game from an exported file, and also how to start dialogues in your game. Here we have the candyengine.gd script, and I talked about that script briefly earlier. This script is the core code of the dialogue engine. It contains 90% of the code for running dialogues. So here in candyengine.gd, we have this function here, load scripted dialogue, and you need to provide the name of the dialogue file as an argument. So as a reminder, the candyengine.gd script is attached to your dialogue UI. So here we have another script, and let's say this is a script inside your game. Okay, and you have a function here. It doesn't matter what the function is, you just have a function. So let's say we want to use the Candy UI. That's the default UI for dialogues. And we want the Candy UI to load the dialogue that we just exported earlier. So we just do it like this. The Candy UI is an auto load, so we type the prefix or the name for the Candy UI, and then we write the function load scripted dialogue, and we provide the name of the dialogue file. This is the exported file we created earlier in the Candy Dialog Creator. That's it. This is going to tell Candy UI, load this dialog here from the dialogues folder. It always looks inside the dialogues folder, so make sure your dialogues are exported to the dialogues folder. And what's going to happen is the dialogue will be loaded here in this dictionary. And once the dialogue is loaded in here, we can run it. Now, to run the dialogue, we need to call this function here, start dialogue. And the function takes 3 arguments: the conversation that the dialogue starts at, the block that the dialogue starts at, and the line that dialogue starts at. So we're going to copy the function. We're going to go back to our game script. And we're going to call the function again in Candy UI. And we're going to provide the names of the conversation and the block to start at. And we also need to tell the dialog engine, the Candy UI, which line in the block we want to start at. And most of the time, you probably want to start at the first line in the block. That's the most logical. So just type 0. And this is 0 means it's the line at index 0. It's the first line in the block. And that's it. You can specify another line if you have a reason for that. But again, usually the first block where a conversation begins, it would probably start at line 0. And that's it. So that's it. We load the dialog, and then we run the dialog.